you, Christopher. So yeah, we've got a slight change in plan today. One of the panelists from the second Great Power Competition panels has pulled out, so we're running one rather epic session with 4 talks in it. I'll start by introducing all of the 4 panelists, and then, well, 5 panelists, there are 2 for 1, and then they'll give their presentations, up to 15 minutes. We're not quite under the same time pressure as we were before, so I may be lenient there if it sounds interesting. After they've given their presentations, there'll be 15 or 20 minutes for questions. So our first panelists are Noor Mirza, if I pronounce that vaguely correctly. She's a Masters of Global Governance candidate at the Vasily School of International Affairs in Waterloo. She has a BA in Political Science and History, specializing in global governance, and also has a French minor, which is very commendable. Her research interests include international relations in the Middle East and South Asia, particularly post 9/11, and the political effects of conflict in these regions. So I'd like to hand over to Ben Anderson-Krim. He's going to talk about geriatric peace or midlife crisis, examining societal aging and revisionist great power foreign policy. So over to you, Ben.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Hill. Let me just pull up the presentation here. All right, so geriatric peace or midlife crisis, examining societal aging and revisionist great power foreign policy. So my name is Benjamin Anderson-Krim. I'm currently a student at the University of St. Andrews here in sunny Scotland. And there's a lot to get through, so let's just jump right into it. So basically what I've been looking at is how does the impact of societal aging affect countries' foreign policies, and specifically when you look at revisionist great powers like Russia and China, who are either undergoing demographic decline or imminently will be undergoing demographic decline. How does that impact the way that they formulate their foreign policy? So in general, there's been an academic consensus around this idea of geriatric peace. So there's been a number of different papers that you can look to. Haas has released a few different papers in 2007, 2017, 2021. Brooks et al. Released a very significant paper in 2019 that showed through statistical analysis that older societies are more peaceful at the international level. And then finally, Sheen in 2013 released a region-specific examination of Northeast Asia. And he argued that because China, South Korea, and Japan are all undergoing significant and severe societal aging, that we can expect the region to become more peaceful, and we can expect to see a decrease in tensions there. And so there's a few reasons why we can understand this as the case. So basically, it comes down to capabilities and motivation. So on the capability side, there's a few different factors. So first of all, a reduction in manpower, and specifically youth manpower, leads to increasing per unit personnel costs. And basically that's because those young people who can serve in the military are now in higher demand across all of society as their supply decreases, the cost to hire them increases. And so paying to upkeep a large military crowds out investment in other capabilities. And then second, more butter and less guns. And so effectively what this means is that as states face increasing budget constraints created by entitlements to those who are retiring, they will naturally face a trade-off between maintaining those entitlements versus maintaining or increasing military spending. And generally what we've seen is that states tend to focus their spending on the entitlements for elderly folk as opposed to maintaining significant military capabilities. And then finally, what we see is that there are lower GDP growth rates from declining working age population, as well as lower levels of investment. And this over the long term structurally reduces the potential growth rates for countries undergoing societal aging. And then on the motivation side of things, countries that are undergoing societal aging or have undergone societal aging face a few reasons why they actually would want to engage in military interventions less. So first of all, because there are smaller families, that is, instead of people having 4, 5, 6 children, they're having 1, maybe 2 children. There's significantly increased casualty aversion, which essentially just comes down to the fact that a family that only has 1 or 2 children, if one of them dies in a foreign war, then their family bloodline effectively ends there. And there's a lot of very good research that shows that lower fertility rates ultimately increases casualty aversion. But then second, there's some good research that shows that older populations are generally less supportive of the use of military force as a means of securing their goals in the international system. And there's a number of reasons for that, but I won't go into all of those right now. So into this general academic consensus comes Jennifer Scuba, who argued in a 2014 paper that actually we don't necessarily always see a geriatric piece from societies undergoing societal aging and demographic decline. So she argued in her paper, Coffins versus Cradles, Russian Population, Foreign Policy, and Power Transition Theory, that in fact, Russia, a state that was undergoing severe population decline and societal aging, actually could be prompted by this societal aging and population decline to engage in more risky and more aggressive actions in the international system. And so specifically, she applied power transition theory and argued that when demographic decline worsens, Russia will engage in aggressive actions towards inferior states. Whereas when the demographic picture improves, the country will engage in aggressive actions towards superior states, which in this case would be the system level competitor of the United States. So she examined the period between 2006 and 2012, which is when the Russian leadership, Vladimir Putin and Medvedev, became significantly more concerned about their country's demographic prospects and directly began to deal with the issues of population decline that the country was facing. And she actually finds that her her thesis coming out of power transition theory has a lot of empirical support in Russian foreign policy in that period. And so this actually serves as a direct rebuttal to the geriatric peace theory. And in that way, it really is a bit of rebel literature against the academic consensus and potentially shows us another way of analyzing the issue. So my research focused on looking at Russia and China between 2013 and 2018. And so what I found was that broadly, in these years, Russia fit the analysis of Scuba in her earlier 2006 to 2012 timeframe, which is essentially that Russia focused its aggression against its regional neighbors, its smaller regional neighbors, when it was undergoing the most severe demographic decline. But when their situation improved, they tended to take on their system level competitor of the United States. So this was not necessarily the case for China between 2013 and 2018. And actually what I found was that China in these years neither particularly fit Scuba's analysis, but also did not fit the model of the geriatric peace theory. And so basically, I tried to look at exactly why that might be the case. And China is a very different case than Russia. So for one, with regards to the demographic decline that it's undergoing, During this period of 2013 to 2018, China was primarily facing long-term issues of declining births and a failure to address its demographic issues. This is quite different from the Russian case, where Russia was very actively facing demographic decline as a mix of due to low fertility as well as a severe health crisis that's gripped the country in the last 30 years. But also, we can potentially look at the fact that 2006 to 2012 and 2013 to 2018 were very different time periods with regards to the global balance of power. The 2006 to 2012 timeframe can broadly be described as being within the American unipolar moment, while in the 2013 to 2018 timeframe, we actually see growing multipolarity. And so that might have acted as a more significant structural facilitator of Chinese foreign policy, particularly as it was the primary challenger to US hegemony. But then also, I think we should examine the fact that, while Russia is both an inferior and declining power relative to the United States, China remains an economically and militarily rising great power, challenging American global hegemony. And so broadly, China has more reason to hold back some of its aggression, because they can still see the prospect of further gains in the future, whereas in Russia, there's a sense of strategic pessimism as the country's economy either actively declines or stagnates while its population shrinks. So what this brought me to was that potentially we need a new addition to the geriatric peace theory. And I have titled it the theory of midlife crisis, which essentially points to the fact that revisionist great powers are going to act quite differently than status quo great powers when it comes to undergoing demographic decline. So while status quo powers have good reason to engage in retrenchment and to try and focus on their internal problems of demographic decline while they're undergoing them, revisionist great powers still have significant foreign policy objectives that they feel they need to accomplish before they face terminal decline as a result of their poor demographics. And so the way that I've theorized this is ultimately that for revisionist states, population decline and societal aging may act in a somewhat similar way theoretically as democratization. So Mansfield and Snyder, in their paper Democratization and the Danger of War in 1995, essentially found that states in the early stages of democratization were more likely to engage in armed conflict. Whereas in the latter stages of democratization, they became significantly more pacific. And so we can look at the issue of societal aging in a broadly similar way. It may be that for revisionist states, and of course this remains speculative, and we will really only be able to see this over the next few decades, but it may be for revisionist states that in the early stages of population aging and demographic decline, that they fear the effects of what will happen later down the line. And so they may act more aggressively in order to achieve their long-term foreign policy objectives. But ultimately, as the effects of aging affect their capabilities and motivations more severely, they may ultimately become more peaceful. So I just want to add a quick note here talking about the current situation. So my research primarily happened prior to the invasion, but the current invasion actually fits fairly well within the framework as developed by Scuba, as well as the midlife crisis theory, which is that during coronavirus, Russia's mortality crisis and their failing public health system were shown very clearly. And as a result, the country faced very significant peacetime demographic decline. And in fact, between October of 2020 and September of 2021, the Russian population fell by about 1 million. And so facing their demographic problems up front Russian leadership may have increasingly viewed their situation as dire, leading them to act more aggressively against an inferior regional state, in this case, Ukraine. We can also see that during the current invasion, Russia has been facing some significant manpower problems, which, although I don't want to get too much into the weeds on the system by which Russia recruits and retains its military personnel, this might be a sign of Russia's population decline and the decreasing number of eligible young men that it can put into the field. And so to bring this back to the core issues that this conference is trying to look at.
So you could just think about wrapping up in a minute or two, Ben, please. Thanks.
Of course. So very quickly, so for the next decade, the Russia's last large cohort are going to begin to enter retirement during the 2030s. And so they may feel a strong incentive to act quickly before this happens. And then with regards to China, the country is about to face a significant cohort going into retirement, which will decrease its room for economic growth. And as a result, they may also feel significant incentives to try and accomplish their foreign policy goals. I'd say notably the reunification with Taiwan. But just generally, I would also say that this will probably be a more significant issue in the 21st century, even in the US and India, traditional bastions of demographic strength. We're beginning to see a future with demographic decline. So that about wraps me up. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I'm interested in hearing your questions.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Ben. We'll do questions at the end. So moving on, please, to our third presentation by Nathan Smolucha. And that presentation is entitled Mapping Ideologies Across a Geopolitical Battle Space. Over to you, please, Nathan.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Hill. And I wanted to credit you with getting my last name pronounced correctly. It's one of the few occasions that it has been pronounced correctly. But regardless, I want to say good morning to everyone tuning in from the University of Calgary, and a good afternoon to all of my colleagues attending from the University of St. Andrews. My name is Nathan Smolucha, and I'm going to be sharing with you today a brief glimpse at the research being conducted as part of my postgraduate dissertation in the Middle East, Caucasus, and Central Asia Security Studies program here at the University of St. Andrews. Now, rather than this being a comprehensive overview of all of the theoretical models that are being implemented in the research and the case studies as well, it's intended more to be an introductory discussion on the topic, as you're about to see. My topic is on ideology, as you can see, and how security professionals can interact with it, specifically in mapping it across a actual geographical space. And this is relevant, in recent events, given Russia's sphere of influence having turned aggressive in regards to Ukraine. But my particular case studies are going to be highlighting areas a little bit to the further south of Ukraine and to the southeast. So as you can see here, we have my first case study is actually going to be centered around the North Caucasus in a region that is known as Chechnya, and which is considered to be an autonomous republic, but definitely falls under the sphere of influence of Russia. And then the second case study will be focusing on the effect of Central Asian countries and conducting ideological security operations. And I've chosen to highlight a specific region of Central Asia known as the Fergana Valley in this context, and as for reasons we're about to get into. But first things first is that I think I want to get into what theoretical tools I'm going to be using to unpack this topic. And the first and primary theoretical model that I'm going to be working with is frames and framing theory. Now, one of the words that has come up repeatedly is the word of ideology. So we want to get to discussing what exactly is ideology, how do we define it? And for the purpose of my research is that ideology is essentially is represented as a system of moral ideals and beliefs. And the purpose of these beliefs is essentially to serve as a filter for how we perceive the world around us. So we want to think about it entering everything except in the environment entering our filter and how we're going to respond to environmental stimuli as being influenced by this background ideology. Frames then come into play as being intentionally constructed narratives that have been promoted with agency, with intentionality, to give us a certain perspective and help us aid and affect our ability to contextualize socio-political events. Now, to clarify, not all frames are inherently intended to manipulate you or are damaging. In fact, they are necessary in helping to rationalize very complicated political events. Now, frames will interact within a given social space as they compete for an audience. So consider frames as a product looking to compete with other frames in a marketplace of ideas. Our personal frame absorption is determined by how well it resonates with an audience, such as how well we are able to relate our personal experiences to these narratives, as well as how its legitimacy and how accurately we perceive the narrative to be. Now, when I discuss framing competition, this also includes efforts to modify a frame based on security interests, and I envision this security interaction in the following diagram that you're viewing. At the top is a state domain where frames are created by ruling regimes who participate in international relations or actors who regularly participate in the political system. There's a sense of legitimacy brought about through association with the state that defines this specific domain. At the bottom is an unofficial sub-state domain. This contains the foundations of civil society, such as the backgrounds of all those who inhabit a non-governmental space. My research is specifically interested in the role religion plays in this domain as frames contest within the shared space and against the state itself. This will be demonstrated further in the case studies. If you look at the center of the diagram, I want to highlight that there's a space where these two domains intersect. I've called this the threshold of securitization. It's a space where frames are challenged, interact, or modified by state and non-state actor in the interest of security. Security is rather broadly defined here, but it recognizes that there's a potential threat to stability and order primarily aimed at the ruling regime of a given territory. Now, as we move on to the case studies, I'm going to be talking again about Central Asia and the North Caucasus. And I found them particularly interesting because of their ideologically rich sub-state backgrounds. And I've chosen to superimpose them over the security threshold model that you've seen on the previous slide. The traditional sub-state identity was affected quite dramatically in the North Caucasus with the introduction of Islam. And Islam itself has propagated a series of resistance frames. Now, referring back to our discussion of framing, this is not necessarily an ideology, but how you can perceive elements of an ideology, how the ideology affects how you interpret your political reality. And most notably, these resistance frames have been utilized against Imperial Russian expansion during the 19th century, but these resistance frames also historically emanate from Sufism, and is found particularly favored by the fiercely independent tribes of the Caucasus. Now, an example of these resistance frames is the term Ghazavat and jihad by North Caucasus tribes. Ghazavat is understood to be resistance against oppressors and found use in internecine tribal warfare, whereas jihad alternatively, in the context of how North Caucasus imams applied it for social mobilization, was used to rally resistance against Imperial Russian expansion. But there is an important difference between the two, a distinction, despite the literature often referring to them as synonyms. So Ghazavat appears to be unique in itself and should not be confused with synonymous or violent framing of jihadism. And it suggests that a competitive framing environment within Islam itself exists separate of the competition identified between the state and the sub-state domain. Now, moving forward in time, by the 20th century, Russian social policies repressed Islam in both regions. However, major conflicts have invited foreign actors to attempt revitalizing framing practices as a means of destabilizing Russian security during wartime. For example, in World War I, there's evidence of Ottoman combat, military, guerrilla warfare advisors having supported a pan-Turkic uprising in Central Asia. This suggests experiments with frame construction or modification of existing frames to promote pan-Turkic ambitions from the sub-state domain during the Bolshevik Revolution. Just to clarify, although the title of the picture on the bottom left says Ottoman military advisors, I just want to clarify, those are not the Ottoman military advisors. This is a picture of Russian soldiers entering Kazakhstan, the Cossack steppes during the early 20th century. However, by the World War II, we notice a familiar tactic is that the Nazi Wehrmacht revitalized concepts of pan-revolutionism, specifically pan-Islamism, and had its military operations actually coincide with civil support campaign in the Caucasus region. They reopened Islamic schools, mosques, and organized events to promote resistance against the Soviet Union that ultimately did not come to fruition as they were pulled away from the Caucasus to assist in the Eastern Front campaign. Now, by the time after World War II, we're getting into a period where the Soviet Union recognized that Islam had a history of social mobilization and was actively being targeted by foreign actors as a vulnerability during wartime. This led to tragic ethnic and ideological cleansing of both regions, but it also resulted in the creation of spiritual governing boards that determined official and unofficial Islamic practices. Here's basically a sample graph building off what was initially shown in slide 3, which was the state and sub-state domain diagram. And in the case of this image, alternative framings of Sufism compete for legitimacy in the securitized space at the center, depicted in the dark gray boundary. It's important to note that Soviet social policies and the introduction of spiritual governing boards, they resulted in a clear separation between official and unofficial Islam in the region. Now, in present day, the securitization of ideology is a regular practice by regime leaders in both Central Asia and the North Caucasus. This is particularly so given the introduction of extremist interpretations of Islam following the collapse of the Soviet Union and loosening of religious restrictions. Of course, the long period of isolation provided a vacuum for new interpretations of Islam, and Salafi Wahhabism quickly established itself in both regions while not necessarily gaining enough strength to directly challenge regime legitimacy. Now, when relating to the North Caucasus, I want to highlight and emphasize the role of Ramzan Kadyrov, who is currently the head of the Chechen Republic. And his particular take on state Sufism integrates religious ideas that from the sub-state domain, the unofficial Islamic practice, that strengthen his association with the sub-state and civil society. Yet he still modifies his religious outlook based on his current political needs. So we can see a clear segregation between a state and an unofficial state Islam. This further strengthens his ideological base against Salafi challenges to his regime legitimacy that have since dissipated during the Second Chechen War. Islam Karimov, depicted on the right, is the former president of Uzbekistan, and he was instrumental in identifying and securitizing Salafi framing in the Fergana Valley. Fergana Valley has historically been a haven for Islamic resistance dating back to Imperial Russian expansion into the region. Efforts to label particular takes on Islam have been expanded by various regime leaders in Central Asia to include varying political opponents over the years and acts as a means of ensuring regime legitimacy as well as stability. Moving on to my final diagram of my presentation here, I want to show you one concept that I think has been egregiously overlooked is the idea of making a two-dimensional model three-dimensional. And what you're seeing here is actually the security threshold model that's been rotated. So instead of it being a two-dimensional image, we're now rotating and looking at it from a z-axis straight up and down, or straight from the top down. So this is the inverted threshold of securitization diagram where frames compete in the name of security interests. The state and sub-state Salafi practices have found themselves oriented against Salafi Wahhabism as a challenger to both sectors. Exploring the dynamics of these competing frames seeks to further research into the field of ideological warfare and how state and individual practitioners can apply frames in a conflict setting. So lastly, I just want to thank everyone for attending my presentation today. Central Asia and the North Caucasus are excellent examples of competing frames that borrow from historical ideologies and that exist in both state and sub-state domains. Here's my visual and select sources on framing theory. And if anyone would like to receive a copy of the historical sources I've consulted for my research, I would welcome you to contact me independently using my email provided at the bottom of this slide. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Nathan. Thanks very much. So moving on to our final presentation, we have, hopefully, there he is, Carter Brust, Revitalizing the Art of War, Chinese Hybrid Warfare and the Subversion of Hong Kong.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Hill. So yeah, one of the enduring questions surrounding strategic theory is the extent to which old principles, old means, in this case, from Sun Tzu's Art of War, are still relevant and can be applied over time and space. My goal is to convince you that not only that these principles still do hold weight, but that they're being modified and used in new ways that undercut Western deterrence. So between 2019 and 2021, China fast-tracked the integration of Hong Kong, essentially ending any political or judicial autonomy enjoyed by those living in the territory. So how has China been able to do this? What does this subversion of Hong Kong say about the enduring nature of these strategic principles? And what does this mean for the future of the Sino-American rivalry that is going to unfold over the next, or has been unfolding and will continue to unfold over the next few decades? So the manner in which the territory was seized by Beijing, I argue, points to a new era of warfare, one that blends centuries-old ways with modern means to achieve a desired end. It also exposes the limits of Western, and more specifically American, strategic thinking, and points to a new era in which America no longer, or might no longer, possess the ability to deter actions by its adversaries. So in other words, the loss of Hong Kong, or the so quote-unquote loss of Hong Kong, highlights not only the continued relevance of these strategic principles in modern strategic synthesis, but it will also show that the West's inability to effectively counter this new style of warfare. So I want to talk briefly about Hong Kong, just to give a little bit of context. So the story begins in 1997, not in 2019, when Britain formally gave up the colony of Hong Kong to the Chinese. Over the nearly 150 years of British rule, the territory experienced significant economic growth under Western political and judicial institutions. In 1997, China and Britain agreed to a 50-year transition period in which Hong Kong would be slowly integrated with the mainland. This is where we get the one country, two systems policy, in which Hong Kong would technically be considered part of China, but would still retain its own governmental system, legal system, economic, financial affairs, including trade with foreign countries. The one country, two systems was designed to return the city gradually to Chinese sovereignty without destroying some of the basic freedoms that its citizens had come to value. However, recent moves by China have undermined this agreement and served to fast-track the integration. The first of this was on March 29th, 2019, when the Legislative Council of Hong Kong proposed the now famous Fugitive Offenders Amendment Bill, which would have allowed extradition of offenders to mainland China. This was the bill that sparked massive protests. I'm sure many of you remember, most famously with the umbrellas in Hong Kong. Although the bill was eventually withdrawn, it signaled the intentions of Beijing to move against Hong Kong. On June 30th, 2020, Beijing passed the Hong Kong Security Law, which is still in effect, criminalizing what they called secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign or external forces. The language of the law was deliberately vague, or essentially criminalizing any attempt to criticize Beijing or the Chinese Communist Party, even if you weren't a member of mainland China. As a result of the passage of the law, the United States essentially considered Hong Kong to have reverted to a one country, one system policy, and since 2020 has done relatively little to reprimand China with. So what happened? What did China do here, and why was there so little reaction from the West? One of the most effective ways of conducting warfare across time and space has been to convince your enemy that there is no conflict taking place at all, blurring the lines between war and peace. The goal is to orchestrate confusion and chaos to prevent the enemy from reacting in order to retain the initiative and dictate the nature of the conflict. If your opponent doesn't recognize if your opponent does not recognize that they are at war, that makes it easier to outsmart and outplay them. The modern concept of hybrid warfare tends to fit well within Sun Tzu's components on the use of force. Hybrid warfare, as I'm sure many of you are aware of, is quite a slippery term and is defined differently by different people in different times. As a bare minimum, for the purposes of this presentation, hybrid warfare embodies both physical and conceptual dimensions. What those look like depend, as I mentioned, on where such actions are taking place. As I'll mention later on, the primary objective, according to Sun Tzu, is to subjugate other states without actually engaging in any armed combat. Whenever possible, this should be achieved through diplomatic finesse, thwarting the enemy's plans and alliances, and frustrating its overall strategy. Each campaign should therefore focus on achieving maximum results with a minimum risk and exposure so as not to provoke a response from the adversary, where any overt involvement can be plausibly denied. Modern Chinese strategy can be traced back to the Gulf War, which demonstrated how not to fight the West in an open conventional engagement. In the 1990s, the Chinese military planners began to focus on the informationalization of the PLA, bringing it into the modern digital era, renewing their emphasis on political warfare along with its three subcomponents known to Chinese policymakers as the three warfares of psychological warfare, public opinion warfare, or also known as information warfare, and legal warfare or lawfare. By the time the Hong Kong question came up in the spring of 2019, Chinese strategists could draw on three key areas of strategic inspiration in their campaign. The first was the classical strategic thought that placed emphasis on preparation, adaptation, and formlessness. There would be no tanks rolling into Hong Kong. There would be no troops there would be no PLA troops marching through the streets, but rather a fluid campaign that blurred the lines between war and peace. The second was Russia's activities in Ukraine in 2014, which demonstrated the effectiveness of a fluid strategy of hybrid warfare, allowing one state to move against another with a high degree of success. The third and most important inspiration for Chinese moves in Hong Kong was the West's response to Russia's activities. The United States had really no means of challenging or countering Moscow's activities other than imposing sanctions, as this form of hybrid warfare didn't really fit within the ways the West viewed the conduct of warfare. The West, and more specifically the United States, excels at conventional forms of open warfare, where it's clear who the enemy is, where they are operating, and what they are trying to achieve. China and other actors such as Russia have been able to capitalize on this and fly under the radar. The United States also likes to think of warfare in terms of binaries. There is war and there is peace, and those two separate phenomenons can be defined and understood as such. This has led to the assumption that America's adversaries are organized, structured, and motivated by long-term strategic goals that are equivalent, although diametrically opposed to those of the United States. Within this framing, China's moves can supposedly be anticipated and countered by means of conventional forces. This has proven not to be the case, as China knows that it can capitalize on this binary notion of war or peace, which limits American action or reaction. Intelligence also plays a key role in the development of Chinese strategy. Sun Tzu, along with other famous strategic thinkers such as Clausewitz, places a premium on a commander's ability to gather and utilize information, whether it be through simple observation or the clandestine use of spies. Everything is to be known about the adversary in order to develop an accurate picture of their capabilities, strategy, and deployment. However, it is not enough to only study the adversary. You also have to know your own strengths as well. This is where you get to know the enemy and know yourself, and you need not fear the outcome of any engagement, or something along those lines. I'm not quite sure of the direct quote, but effective gathering and the use of intelligence will then allow the commander to engage in deception. Another key theme present throughout the art of war. Sun Tzu states bluntly that all warfare is deception, where the goal is to confuse and prevent your opponents from conducting their own successful operations, whether this be through decoy tanks or disinformation. Chinese spies or agents are not your stereotypical fedora-wearing men in trench coats carrying briefcases, engaging in brush passes in the subway systems. Beijing has been pioneering softer forms of deception, espionage, and infiltration based on penetration, a process in which China insinuates its people, its non-party loyalists, and ideology into society, both at home and abroad. This involves placing people loyal to the Communist Party in places of power, or grooming those already in places of power to toe the party line. In the case of Hong Kong, Chinese planners have undertaken a similar campaign of infiltration and influence. The chief executive of Hong Kong, or almost de facto mayor of Hong Kong, Carrie Lam, has come under fire in recent years for her supposed connections to Beijing. Lam remains a vocal and unrepentant supporter of the 2019 extradition bill and continues to stand firm against the demands of many of the protesters. Although not a member of the CPC, Lam, according to numerous commentators, is best understood as this non-party loyalist who deliberately deceives and misleads. The Communist Party has also cultivated the territory's business elites, as well as members of their criminal underground. These members can serve as mediators between Beijing and the situation in Hong Kong, passing information to their colleagues on the mainland. Whether this be through formal channels in actually being on the payroll of the CPC, or just talking with individuals connected to the Chinese Communist Party. These individuals allow the protest to grow, arise, and eventually die out, while slowly subverting this one country, two systems by flushing out high-profile dissidents. Given the knowledge of these tactics, why does the West allow this stuff to go on? Because after 2014, there was this massive outpouring of literature on hybrid warfare and subversion and all of the things associated with that. One of the reasons is that these connections and networks of influence are really hard to trace without diving into the realm of conspiracy theories. Without solid evidence, it's hard to identify connections in the first place, let alone take actions against individuals or corporations. There's also a very low operational cost to these activities from the Chinese side, compared to more traditional forms of infiltration. Getting knowledge of American capabilities, technologies, and strategies can simply mean sending young adults to study in American universities who then return to China or travel to Hong Kong to work in companies connected to the CCP. The key reason why these strategies of infiltration and deception work is that for the most part, this process is a one-way street. The CIA may have agents in China, but they're not running Washington institutes designed to spread American culture in Shanghai, Chongqing, or Shenzhen, designed compared to the Confucius Institutes that have been popping up all over the United States in recent decades. Likewise, there are also not millions of Americans rushing to study in China's top universities. So the idea of winning without fighting is perhaps the most iconic principle from Sun Tzu. The direct quote is, "Subjugating the enemy's army without fighting is the true pinnacle of excellence." And China has more or less been following this. China's deployment of overwhelming conventional force during the Tiananmen crackdown of 1989 really set the stage for how they wanted to move forward in future operations. That crackdown really soured the opinion of China in the minds of a lot of Westerners, and this resulted in China moving away from the idea of more of a harsh crackdown. There wouldn't be a similar Tiananmen-style crackdown in Hong Kong lest China risk a more significant backlash from the West. They sat back, waited for the right time to move as international attention, especially in the West, shifted to other matters: Brexit, COVID, and the ongoing American 2020 presidential election. If you're China, you hide your capabilities, you bide your time, build the necessary networks, and then when an opportunity is presented to you, you move quickly and decisively. Winning without fighting is designed to leave the adversary in the dark, to confuse and deceive them into submission without knowing they have even lost. This involves defeating the enemy's will to fight, which ties back to knowing yourself and the enemy. China knew that there would be some backlash, and indeed there was. Western companies and pulled their business out of Hong Kong. But if they moved carefully, they could fly under the radar and avoid provoking a concerted response from the West. So what are some conclusions we can draw from this? The events in Hong Kong have demonstrated that far from being antiquated or outdated, the classical strategic insights of Sun Tzu remain highly, highly relevant in modern strategic synthesis. Accurate intelligence allows one to deceive and subvert the enemy and win without fighting, while blurring the lines between war and peace allows one to plan and execute a strategy that is highly fluid and extremely difficult to counter if you're not aware of what's going on. So what does this tell us about China and Chinese strategy? First, it reaffirms the notion that Xi Jinping isn't going to liberalize anytime soon and will take steps to secure a future in which China is strong internally and can project externally an image of power. It's not going to be influenced by the infiltration of foreign ideas outlined in the now famous document number 9. Second, it gives us insight to a potential strategy to be used against Taiwan. It's important to remember that while Taiwan isn't in the same position as Hong Kong legally in relation to China, and any subversion would need to be conducted on a larger scale, it doesn't mean that similar tactics of subversion can't or won't be used to slowly subvert the Taiwanese state over years or even decades. That being said, over the last 2 years, China has been ramping up military activities around the island. While an overt invasion at this point is pretty unlikely, what if the invasion has already begun, with China slowly putting its people into place in the internal business, economic, and political communities of Taiwan? It's tough to say, and the future will flesh out some of those details. China has also proposed to apply the one country, two systems principle to Taiwan. Again, this doesn't mean that Taiwan will be annexed anytime soon, but Putin's actions in Ukraine may point to a future in which sufficient internal subversion or destabilization can be a prelude for a more conventional invasion, one in which Western aid might not be forthcoming. Drawing on inspiration from the military classics of ancient China, Beijing's adaptive response to the external environment has involved a widening and rethinking of the definition of warfare. This has caused a lot of problems in the West. Western planners now risk what I call conceptual envelopment, a situation in which an adversary's conception of war becomes so much broader than our own, leading to a disconnect between the two sides. China may be acting in ways it considers warlike, while we in the West, with our more narrow and binary notion of warfare, remain blissfully or carelessly unaware of the fact, so that by the time we actually realize we were at war, we've already lost. On June 23rd, 2020, then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo delivered one of the most striking speeches on China, stating that America could no longer ignore the fundamental differences, political and ideological, between the two countries. In the realm of strategic thought, there are fundamental differences between the two. China has been on the rise. America, or at least the primacy of American influence around the world, has been on the wane. The United States needs to decide whether or not they want to remain the world leader when it comes to norms and institutions, especially when those norms are challenged, whether they be in Hong Kong, Ukraine, or in Taiwan. The West's enemies push where there's mush. So as long as the United States is unwilling or unable to successfully reinforce or flush out these mushy areas, its adversaries will continue to test the waters. As Beijing becomes more willing to take risks internationally with a larger and more coercive toolkit than ever before, China's actions over the past 2 years should remind Washington and everyone else in the West that conventional American or Western military superiority should not be taken for granted. Although China and the United States may be using the same game board, Hong Kong has demonstrated that Beijing is playing chess while Washington is playing checkers. Until the United States can recognize this fact and adjust its strategy accordingly, I believe that China will continue to act with impunity and take pieces. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank